Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your break. I checked out David Murphy's poem in the Wellness Centre in the conference menu bar. So thank you, David, for that poem. It's really great. I encourage everyone to check it out. It has the theme of what masking is like. So thank you so much for that. So up next, I will be handing over to Dr. Susan Hayward, and she will be your MC for the Lived Experience panel. Dr. Susan Hayward is an Autistic Research Fellow at the University of Melbourne. Her research interests include the employment and social inclusion of neurodivergent people, as well as strengthening the psychological health and well-being of neurodivergent people. So I will hand over to Susan. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Karine, and welcome back, everybody. So just a quick note, questions are welcome. Please submit those via Slido using the event code, which is 720731. Just a quick note, our lived experience panel will be discussing their personal experiences. They are not and cannot provide advice to individuals of a personal nature. So any advice provided here should be considered just general, like of a general nature. So perhaps we'll start with a brief intro of each panel member. For example, how you came to your autism diagnosis and why you're on the panel. So can I start with you, Jack?
Sure. Oh, excuse me. So good morning, everyone. I am Dr. Jack Den Houting. I am a postdoctoral research fellow at Macquarie University. I conduct autism research. I am also an autistic person. I came to my autism diagnosis when I was 25 years old. I have a brother who was diagnosed as autistic young. And always knew that I had some sort of autistic traits, but grew up during a time where there was a particular understanding of what autism was, and my experience didn't fit within that, the understanding at the time. Yeah, it wasn't until I was older that I came to realize that my experience actually was the experience of an autistic person, and not just a few autistic traits. Yeah, so that's how I came to my diagnosis. I am somebody obviously with lived experience of autism, also with a collection of mental health diagnoses and various experiences relevant to suicide as well. So I guess that's why I'm on the panel. And also I have professional experience as a psychologist. My background is in psychology, and before I was a researcher, I worked as a psychologist. So I have some experience, I guess, from a professional perspective as well. So yeah, that's me.
Thank you, Jack. Axel?
Hi, my name is Axel. My pronouns are he, his. I'm a creative writing PhD candidate at the University of New South Wales at the moment. I was first diagnosed with autism when I was 7 years old. I had a very substantial mental health crisis, and I was very privileged that when I was seen by a psychologist, they automatically recognized that it wasn't just mental illness, but neurodivergence as well, including my state of decline. So for pretty much as long as I can remember, autism has been a big part of my self-knowledge, a big part of my identity, and it informs every single part of my life. I'm here today because I think that education on autism is generally limited, and I really want to elevate general understanding of autism wherever I can, for greater compassion, greater training for health and education professionals, and generally greater support for autistic people through all stages of life. My experiences of suicidal ideation, severe depression, and just absolute isolation, I believe, have been quite, inevitable in some ways in terms of my biology, my innateness as an autistic person. But I do think that so much pain can be avoided if only enough support is there.
Thank you, Axel. Gilly?
Hello. So I'm Jilly, and I'm an autistic woman, obviously. I have a child who is 6 years old who is also autistic. I was diagnosed earlier this year, and basically my diagnosis came about. I started noticing a lot of similarities between my daughter and myself. And just the more I learned about autism, the more I read about autism, and then the more I watched her and put it all together, it just made sense. And then last year we had another ASFAR conference, and basically I attended that. And then the presentations about burnout, masking, adult autistic presentation, just really identified with them very much. And then basically made the decision, to seek diagnosis. I'm also a PhD candidate through UTAS, and I'm researching autism and physical activity. But I'm on the panel, obviously, to give experience as a late diagnosed autistic person, mother of an autistic child. And I struggled with my mental health a lot more in my teenage years, self-harm and things like that. So that's why I'm on the panel.
Thanks, Jilly. Erin?
Yeah, hi, I'm Erin. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I was diagnosed a few years ago in my mid-30s. So in my work as a clinical psychologist, I trained in autism diagnoses around 10 years ago. And then when I was conducting the assessments, I found myself relating really heavily to the experiences of autistic people. Excuse me. I would be thinking like, I do that, that's my experience too, or I do something very similar. And I'd be seeing people meeting the diagnostic criteria based upon experiences that were really similar to my own. And so this led to quite a lot of sort of cognitive dissonance and confusion on my part, because I had this strong belief that I was, neurotypical and non-autistic, as well as an underlying implicit belief that, I couldn't be autistic because I was a psychologist. Which was a bit of an us-them mindset, not something I'm particularly proud of, but that was my experience. And that was a significant barrier for me to embrace my own sort of autistic identity at the time. So eventually I kind of worked through this internalized stigma and ableism, which kind of happened alongside a natural shift in the way I was practicing, which became more and more kind of aligned with the neurodiversity paradigm. And I came to realize I am autistic, which I then rubber stamped for my own personal reasons by seeking a formal autism diagnosis before coming out professionally. So I'm on the panel today to give input that brings my lived experience as a late diagnosed autistic woman together with my professional knowledge as a clinical psychologist working with autistic clients.
Thanks, Erin. Okay, so the topic for the panel is, what are the difficulties and the ways we can overcome them for autistic people to obtain the help they need from mental health professionals? So I might pose a question to, if Jack and then Jilly could respond, perhaps. How can the diagnostic process impact getting help from mental health professionals?
Yeah, so I think, I think there are so many answers to this question. The diagnostic process is, or it can be, a minefield when it comes to autism. I think there's a real lack of knowledge, unfortunately, amongst diagnosticians when it comes to autism. unless you happen to find a diagnostician who actually specializes in autism, chances are, you're going to come across somebody who holds a lot of outdated beliefs around what autism is. We unfortunately still hear stories of people, being told they can't possibly be autistic because they make eye contact and things like that, which we know these days are obviously just totally inaccurate. I think thinking about mental health more specifically, we need to be quite wary of the idea of diagnostic overshadowing. So often people, autistic people will get a diagnosis of something like anxiety or depression, perhaps early on, or when they first sort of present for help, and then any subsequent sort of challenges or difficulties that come up are attributed to that diagnosis. So you're struggling with that because of your anxiety, you're struggling with that because you've got OCD, and that so that's I guess a phenomenon that we call diagnostic overshadowing, is that idea that once you have one diagnosis, that diagnosis overshadows all other possible diagnoses, and you sort of just get stuck with this one diagnosis. And in some cases that might be an accurate diagnosis, but it may not capture everything about that person's experience. And in a lot of cases, that diagnosis may actually be an inappropriate diagnosis too, as we know with a lot of late diagnosed autistic people, and particularly late diagnosed autistic females. There's a lot of people who receive quite a number of inaccurate diagnoses before they finally get the autism diagnosis. So I think it's really important to be aware of I guess the differentiation between what is anxiety, what is depression, and what is actually autism, and to not fall into that trap of just assuming that all of somebody's experiences can be attributed to this one diagnosis that they've already been given, and whether there may be other things, other factors at play, including autism, that are impacting on that person.
Julie, would you like to chime in as well?
Yeah. So as Jack said, obviously there is still so much misunderstanding, and we still see that there is this young boys who like trains, and then so many people get missed because they don't fit with that particular idea of autism. So basically, as a late diagnosed person, I just say like it's really hard to go through like life as an autistic person going into a world where you don't particularly fit. But if you don't understand that, and you don't understand why you do certain things, you don't understand why people treat you differently or why you struggle, and all of that is really difficult to kind of navigate, and it can have big effects on your mental health, because you end up basically labeling yourself like, oh, I'm just weird, or I'm just socially anxious, or I'm just lazy, and you attach all these negative labels to yourself, and then other people attach the negative labels to you on top of that. And it is basically just really confusing and exhausting, and until you have any idea of what is actually happening, like when you maybe start thinking, oh, I might be autistic, this is what it is, which happens with a lot of parents of autistic children. They see things in their children and then think, oh, actually that is very much like me, or like I was when I was a child. And I think that's why there's a lot more late diagnosis happening amongst parents. And it's really important, like not everyone has to get a diagnosis, and obviously a lot of people can't get diagnosis for different reasons. Financial constraints, waiting lists are huge. As we know, there are problems with being believed, and the stereotype view of what autism is, which also causes problems. But when you do get a diagnosis, or at least you have a really strong understanding of yourself, it just allows you to basically give grace to yourself. It allows you to connect with the autistic community, find people that just don't judge you, understand you, and you can develop like a much more positive identity when you have that understanding. And I just think that's really important for people's mental health when they get that.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. So I'm wondering, Jack, maybe, what do you think about the perception of autism impact, like how that impacts getting help from mental health professionals?
Yeah, I think what Julie's been talking about is really relevant. Actually, that sort of the idea of autism as being a thing that young boys have, and the as I mentioned before, the outdated perceptions of what autism is, makes a really big difference in terms of both getting a diagnosis and also how you're then treated once you are diagnosed as being autistic. And I think what professionals maybe perceive that you need or perceive that you're capable of. I think there's probably an element of reluctance as well to give an autism diagnosis, because of the stigma and the prejudice that exists around it. A lot of professionals are quite reluctant if somebody is sort of maybe on the borderline of being autistic, or is even clearly autistic but maybe doesn't necessarily have particularly high support needs. Professionals might be a little reluctant to give that diagnosis because of their own sort of stigma around what that diagnosis means, and the perception that it's a bad thing, and this is going to hold the child back or somehow negatively impact the person. Whereas as Julie just said, for most autistic people, having the diagnosis is hugely beneficial, and it's a huge relief, and it answers so many questions, and it's yes, it's a label, but most autistic people that I know have applied much worse labels to themselves to try and explain their experiences, and I'd certainly rather call myself autistic than call myself any of the things that I believed about myself before I knew I was autistic. So I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind, around diagnostics. I was really interested to hear what the keynotes this morning were saying in terms of some of the warning signs around suicidality, because there are certainly things that they were talking about that I personally have experienced, in terms of how clinicians perceive autistic people in distress, and how our distress maybe doesn't look the way that people expect it to look, and that can then impact our access to help. I've certainly found myself in positions where I've been very distressed, very much at crisis point and in need of immediate help. But my presentation during those times is essentially much more neurotypical. I become still and quiet, and I appear very calm on the outside, whereas typically, I'm sort of fidgeting and stimming and doing all sorts of things that appear much more autistic. So to a professional, you know, I can say I'm in crisis, I need help now, but I look like a non-autistic person who is perfectly calm. And I have had experiences in the past where that has actually meant that professionals have not taken any action, even though I'm telling them I'm in crisis. So I think that's definitely something I would encourage people to take away from today, is the idea that autistic distress and autistic crisis doesn't necessarily look like neurotypical crisis. And if someone, you know, if someone is telling you that they're in crisis, or if you have reason to believe that they're in crisis, regardless of how they may appear, it's better to be safe than sorry.
Yeah, agreed. Axel, have you got thoughts on this?
Absolutely. So I'm a transgender man. I was assigned female at birth, and I lived for 11 years being bred as a girl. And one of the biggest issues in autism diagnosis I'm aware of, which Jillian and Jack have already touched on, is there's such a gendered perception of what autism is. And it's a very toxic assumption. Like, I think both boys and girls and non-binary people, the idea that, you know, autistic boys are brilliant but belligerent, and autistic girls are dreamy and smart, if a practitioner even acknowledges that girls can be autistic. And that's something I've become very much more aware of as I've medically transitioned and been read by the rest of the world as a man. It's like people don't, clinicians and just other people in day-to-day life don't recognize my autism as something fitting within a gender binary. But every single person's autism is different. We all have traits that could be coded male or female, and even then the coding of it is so toxic. And I think that there's such a high prevalence of transgender autistic people, and I think that part of the reason for that is that as autistic people, we can tell we're on the outside, that there is something different. There's a structure around us that we're not tuned into. And part of that, I think, for people is gender, and noticing that a lot of things are based on performance and masking really well, and learning the things that will mean you're read as a proper girl or a proper boy. And for me, I feel like I'm outside of gender norms, and I'm outside of neurological norms. And I was so privileged that my very first psychologist, when my mental health first started declining, specialized in girls with autism, which was how I was read at the time. And I feel quite sure that that saved my life, because it informed my entire treatment path, how she communicated with me, the clarity with which she prioritized speaking with me, finding out the root cause of where the pain was coming from. And yeah, there was just none of the antiquated perception that autism means brilliance and a lack of social cohesion. It leaves so many of us vulnerable and so many of us without care. And it's been so consistent in my life that the best mental health care I've received has come from practitioners who not only acknowledge and try to understand my autism, but also those who don't try to fix me into a gendered box of autism, and don't try to box me in on gendered grounds in general. So yeah, I think that gender is similar to a lot of social norms that autistic people can struggle to learn. And I think it's sort of a good thing. You know, it means we can come out of the closet, we can recognize that we are trans.
Thanks, Axel. Yes, gender is an extremely important point here. Jilly, have you got thoughts?
Sorry. I think we have touched on masking, but I think there's a lot of people that don't think have a great understanding of masking, because it's something that is kind of only becoming a word that people are recognizing in, I guess, professional circles in more recent times. So I think that is a big thing. Like Jack said, when she has presented in a crisis point, you wouldn't be able to tell because of the way that she presents being differently. And I think the way a lot of autistic people present, whether it's in crisis point or just in everyday life, is not exactly the way that they would present if, like, basically the world was different and people were more accepting of autistic people as they are. Because like, you go through your life and you learn as a young child that some of the behaviors that you do with stimming, for example, or talking a lot about a thing that you're particularly interested in, and people get bored very quickly. You learn as a very young child to basically keep a lid on it, like what interests you or how you feel you need to express yourself. You learn that that's not what people want from you, and they want you to behave and act in a certain way. And you obviously, as a young child, you're not particularly aware that you're doing it, but you just learn skills as a young child. And then so in the classroom, one child could be acting out as a class clown because that's what people expect of them. And that could be a type of masking. Another person in the class could be working really hard, be really quiet, not exhibiting any signs. That's also masking. There's a lot of different ways that people can mask, and it probably changes a lot as you get older as well. Like, I know with me, I would say my understanding of myself masking would be things like, before every social situation, I will script, who might be there, what things I could talk to them about, and have like information prepared so there's no awkward silences, so I don't look weird or uncomfortable or socially anxious. So it's really subtle things that you're not even aware of. You learn to make eye contact even if you don't particularly want to. You learn to laugh at jokes that you don't particularly understand because you know that you're expected to laugh at someone's joke. You pretend to be interested in things that you're not interested in. I've spent hours researching things like the Kardashians because that's what people were talking about, and I have no interest in them, but because I wanted to try and fit in and have something to talk about with people, I spent hours looking up about them and like other things that I generally don't care about, but I know that that's kind of what people expect of me, so I go out of my way to portray this different person than what is like really in my soul. It's not the Kardashians, it's a lot of different things that other people would not be interested in, but they wouldn't pretend to be interested in what I am, but I have to pretend to be interested in what they are. And that, I guess, is the difference of being an autistic person in a neurotypical world. You're always the one that has to fit in and pretend to be someone else or act a different way to what feels natural to you. Like, there's many examples. People that stim learn to stim in smaller movements, so it's not as obvious. And think like just really there's so many examples of what masking is and how people do it, and a lot of them are very subtle. And I would just say, like, it's not something that other people would ever know is going on. You know, I constantly overplan, overthink, overanalyze. Even now, as I'm talking, I'm thinking, is what I'm saying the right thing? Am I like, is my voice intonating in the right way to, you know, come across as I know what I'm talking about? And will people believe me? And like, it's such a constant stream of judging yourself against what you think other people want, and it's very exhausting. And I think once you've done it for a long time, like a lot of obviously late diagnosed people do it without even knowing. And I think one of the things about getting a late diagnosis is you don't necessarily even know who you are as a person anymore, because you don't really know what you like, or you don't really know what you feel comfortable with, or what your sensory needs are. So yeah, masking is just a massive topic, and it's something that people really need to be aware of, because it can have real big impacts on mental health. Because yeah, it's very exhausting and confusing and hard, basically.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, I agree. Masking camouflaging is huge. It's very topical. So how could we provide better mental health support for people on the spectrum? I know you touched on this, Axel, but I'm wondering if you can just elaborate a little.
Yeah, absolutely. So past that point of being a young child and getting a very good psychologist who specialized in girls with autism, my experience has largely been that most psychologists and psychiatrists have only a cursory understanding of autism. And any patient who has need for perpetual care, it's so damaging to be dependent on mental health professionals who aren't understanding of it. Like, I think that the specialists who do have a strong knowledge that they're constantly updating are very rare and clustered around urban centers and very booked up and very expensive. So I think that the core thing is training. I think that there needs to be more ingrained training for psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, people in the public service, for how to best support autistic people. But I think that you know, things being embedded in training, there being explicit incentives to specialize in autism are very important. But I think the core of it is that mental health professionals should be willing to listen to us as autistic people. We are in general very good at self-advocating because we have to do it a lot. And even if we struggle to articulate things, a mental health professional attempting to understand and doing a tiny bit of research can be transformative, because there is knowledge available. Like, this conference is evidence that there is knowledge available. So the first thing to do is to just listen and to try, and to not put us in the it's too hard to deal with, or the thing of erasing that we are autistic in favor of some other diagnosis. So yeah, training and compassion.
Thanks, Axel. Speaking of training, Erin, what do you think about this? You're a
so I think, yeah, I am, yes. So I think a really important aspect of providing better mental health support is, well, first to disengage from the idea that autistic people have a disorder or condition and need help to be, less autistic or more like non-autistic people, which is the same thing with different packaging, and instead recognise autistic culture as a valid phenomenon in and of itself. So the very way that autistic people process information and therefore experience ourselves, others in the world, differs on a neurobiological level. And that's not wrong. It doesn't require fixing, but it does require acknowledgement as a form of culture in and of itself. And this is something that's frequently discussed in the autistic community, but less so in academic and clinical literature. But I think it's a really important idea, and currently is a bit of a passionate interest of mine, Because when we see autistic people as being part of a valid culture, then that encourages non-autistic clinicians to develop their cultural competence in this area. So as Axel said, like reading first-hand accounts of the lived experience of autism that are widely available, like they're all over the internet, you know, from a variety of autistic people with different experiences, in order to be able to provide culturally aware and appropriate professional services. And also it's important that non-autistic mental health professionals not only work on gaining competence around autistic culture, but also develop a concept called cultural humility when working with autistic people. And so cultural humility acknowledges that cultural competence in and of itself isn't enough. So it reminds us, you know, that if we're not part of a culture ourselves, then we'll never fully understand the culture, which means we really need to centre people who are part of the culture and our clients and their culture as the people who hold the information about that culture. And so cultural humility also highlights the importance of non-autistic mental health professionals disengaging from kind of the expert stance when working with autistic clients, and instead engaging in constant self-reflection, like constant self-critique, and asking themselves, like, what assumptions am I making right now? And in particular, you know, which neuronormative assumptions am I making right now? And these sort of neuronormative assumptions can be really hard to spot because they're so tied to the socio-cultural norms that are embedded in society and that are embedded in the training programs for mental health professionals as well. And so things as, you know, simple but as fundamental as how we expect our clients to experience and express emotion are often neuronormative in nature. And by neuronormative, I mean based on like non-autistic or neurotypical people's experiences. You know, and this is like Jack mentioned earlier around their experience of distress and that being misunderstood by non-autistic professionals. And so when an autistic client diverges from that expected expression of emotion, it can lead to misunderstandings in the clinical space. And so a lack of awareness on the part of the clinician of the assumptions that they hold that are underlying that process can then sort of play out in ways that are really detrimental to the autistic client. And so that's just one example, but there's a lot of ways in which this can play out. But if we get to a place of acknowledging autistic culture and seeing both cultural competence and cultural humility as essential for non-autistic mental health professionals when working with autistic clients, you know, it would reduce the uncomfortable, unhelpful, and even harmful experiences that autistic people often talk about when engaging with mental health services.
Thanks, Erin. And Jack, I know you mentioned, you know, how mental illness can present differently in autistic people. Do you have anything to add about how we could provide better mental health support for autistic people?
Yeah, I think, I mean, to echo what Erin has talked about, I think, excuse me, I think that idea of understanding how mental illness can present differently, it really does tie into that idea of cultural competence, because, you know, if you think about working with some of the groups that we may traditionally recognize as being, you know, different cultural groups, I think most professionals would understand that, for example, you know, someone from an Indigenous community is going to potentially present differently if they're experiencing mental illness compared to, you know, someone from sort of a middle-class white background. So I think taking that same understanding into working with autistic people, obviously, you know, the structural and systemic issues at play are very, very different depending on which cultural or minority group you're talking about. But yeah, that the idea of understanding the person's, you know, background, cultural experience, and recognizing autistic experience as one of those minority group experiences, I think is very important in then validating the ways that mental illness can present differently. I think we've heard this morning from the keynote speakers some of the ways that suicidality can present differently in autistic people. There's plenty of research about how anxiety can present differently in autistic people. I actually did my PhD research on on anxiety, and learned a lot about the idea of what's called atypical anxiety, which is sort of symptoms of anxiety that are specific to autistic people, and that essentially sits somewhere between autistic traits and anxiety symptoms, and are sort of very much tied up in both the experience of anxiety and the experience of being autistic. So I think for clinicians, educating yourself about those ideas and those differences in presentation is really important. And I mean, we don't have time to go into the specifics today, but there is plenty of research out there that's come out in the last few years around some of those differences. And I think just following the client's lead as well is really important. If a client is sort of explicitly communicating to you, this is what I'm struggling with, this is what I want to work on, regardless of whether they look like that's what they're struggling with or not, you know, to follow that, and yeah, to sort of just be really respectful of the client's autonomy and the client's choices in terms of their care and what they want support with, and how they feel that they can be best served.
Thanks, Jack. Some good points. We also know that depression is a risk factor for suicide, but Erin, I'm wondering, can you talk a little bit about sort of how maybe clinicians and things could distinguish burnout, like autistic burnout, from depression?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think like autistic burnout is one of the really commonly sort of missed and misdiagnosed autistic experiences. And autistic burnout happens when the demands placed on us exceed our capacity for a period of time, but we override our capacity to keep up with those demands. And this often happens for an extended period of time. So, you know, this could be days, weeks, months, years, decades, that this sort of the overriding of capacity, which then unsurprisingly leads to burnout. And it's quite different from experiences of like occupational burnout, where the source of the burnout is specifically linked, you know, to the demands of work in one aspect of somebody's life. Whereas with autistic burnout, the demands are kind of embedded through our everyday experience across all domains of life. And they're intrinsically tied to being autistic in a fast-paced world that is like not particularly autism friendly for the most part. So autistic burnout presents with features like exhaustion, a reduction in our capacity to manage tasks of daily living, a reduction in our cognitive capacity, so kind of a brain fog and memory, you know, just not being able to remember, not being able to find words, withdrawal from social connections, reduced engagement with interests and the things that we usually like doing. Often we have a reduced tolerance for sensory input. So we might have sensory processing differences all the time, but they kind of become more pronounced often during burnout. And often also suicidal ideation, which often is about just like wanting to escape from the overwhelming kind of nature of life and the demands and to just have a rest, which is quite different, I guess, from what underpins suicidality often in other kind of situations. And there can be secondary impacts, like often people will feel really guilty or self-critical for not being able to keep up with the usual pace of life when they're burnt out. So this is really similar to how depression often presents. In fact, most of the markers of burnout are also markers of depression. So clinicians who are not aware of autistic burnout, which is the majority of mental health clinicians, if we're being honest, unfortunately, will miss autistic burnout and are likely to misdiagnose autistic people with depression instead. And so that might not seem like a big deal, but it's really important to differentiate the two, even though they look almost identical on the surface, because the treatment or the way of approaching each one substantially differs. So the kind of antidote for burnout is about reducing demands, slowing down our pace, reducing camouflaging and masking behaviours, and just resting until we can regain capacity, or resting as much as possible until we can regain capacity. at which point we can work on bringing back the things, the social connections, the interests, the daily tasks, while we're also kind of intentionally carving out a lifestyle that reduces the likelihood of future burnout, which might mean slowing our pace, accessing practical supports, and letting some things that aren't important to us go. But on the other hand, treatment for depression generally includes behavioural activation, also known as activity scheduling, which actually encourages people to do more and be active in order to reduce the symptoms of depression. And so trying to do activity scheduling with someone in acute autistic burnout will just extend the period of that burnout because we're placing more demands on the person. So really taking our time to explore the onset and flavour of the symptoms, to determine if it's burnout or depression or both is really crucial. And often autistic burnout and depression do occur together at the same time, in which case we need to work with people to reduce demands and, promote rest until the acute burnout subsides, and then switch into kind of the activity scheduling kind of approach and other, or whatever treatment or approach we're taking to the depression. But while also very consciously creating a pace of life that's more sustainable in the long term, because we really just want to reduce the frequency and intensity of burnout as much as possible in the future.
Thanks, Sarah, and that was a really thoughtful answer. I'm just mindful of time before we get going on audience questions, but just another quick question for the panel. Perhaps Jilly, maybe if you can answer this first. I'm just wondering about some of the other complexities that there are for people. So supporting autistic adults, including clinicians, like what might they need to consider when they're assisting autistic people?
Yeah, so for me, I would say that parenting is a massive thing, because in pregnancy, after birth, and then obviously all the way through your child growing up, there's extra demands placed on you when you become a parent. I personally had quite bad perinatal anxiety because I was just always, I couldn't get the thoughts out of bad things happening and things like that. And then I was told, oh, you're depressed, just go on some antidepressants. But I knew that was never the case. So I never took antidepressants. Also because I was worried about then what that would do to my baby if I was on medication. So it was all like a vicious circle. But I would say, there's so much extra demands. And especially if you're not aware that you're autistic and you can't understand why, it just seems like you can't particularly cope with this sensory overload of babies screaming, bad smells, no sleep. Like it all just compounds any other issues that you might be having, like executive functioning is very difficult, and then you can internalize all of those things and feel like you're failing as a parent, you feel like you're failing as a human, and then burnout as a parent is not something where you can easily rest and have that time, because obviously you've got your child to look after, and as a single parent it's very difficult. There's lots of periods of time when I felt like I'm in burnout, but I just have to keep going because I have no choice. I'm the only person that can look after my daughter, so I just have to push through. And like, I know I'm completely exhausted and this Christmas break can't come soon enough. But yeah, it's just so many extra demands, and so much, like, your children can have very different sensory needs to you. So you could need like quiet, and they'd be bouncing and jumping all over you and screaming, and it can be too much. But then you feel guilt that you are getting overwhelmed by your child, and then that can also lead to like a vicious circle. So I think parenting, for many different reasons, And then obviously taking your child through, if they're autistic, then you're trying to balance all the challenges of school and bullying and therapies and everything. So I mean, I could probably talk about it for a very long time, but definitely it's a very big challenge, and one that I have struggled with, if I'm completely honest. And I think that's a very common thing amongst autistic parents. It is a challenge, and research is just starting to come out about it, but it is still very under-researched.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, it is. It is under-researched. Axel, have you got thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, absolutely. As discussed, the intersections of autism with other mental illness can be really complex to navigate. It's hard to tell what there's, you know, question of what's being caused by one thing and what's being caused by the other. How are they impacting each other? As someone who has quite a lot of comorbid diagnoses, so I have depression, anxiety, bipolar, and complex PTSD. Figuring out what is just such a puzzle for both me and any clinician engaging with me sincerely. And I think unless a practitioner understands and has tactics to work with me as an autistic patient, treatment can be really quite ineffective or actually harmful. And just understanding that my autism is in everything. It impacts my bipolar, it impacts my trauma, it impacts my experience of traumatic events, it impacts my experience of physical pain. Like, I have quite severe rheumatoid arthritis, and it took so long to get a diagnosis, partially because my ability to locate pain and differentiate it from sensory pain, it was a very substantial struggle. And I think that intersecting diagnoses are always challenging to navigate just within mental illness, but when combined with neurodivergence, that certainly brings its own challenges. And when so much of mental health training is focused around being normal, normative work life, normal relationships, normal sleep patterns, all of these things are made for neurotypical people. And even if some autistic people want to aspire to those things, that's great. But also, neurobiologically, many of us are not equipped for that. And the way that we can be most healthy is by accepting that we are falling outside of the norm.
Thank you, Axel. Do you have anything more to add, or are you?
Oh, I have just failed to unmute myself.
You're good. Okay. All right. So we have time for probably maybe one audience question. So the question is, I might ask Erin actually, if that's okay. So what about autistic psychologists? Might they be best placed to provide support to autistic people?
Yeah, so I might be a bit biased here as an autistic psychologist myself, but I think there are definitely advantages to autistic psychologists providing support to autistic people. So in relation to the concept of like cultural competence and humility that I spoke about earlier, if both the psychologist and the client are autistic, you know, then the psychologist isn't starting from scratch in terms of developing cultural competence and humility. And there are just sort of shared understandings through both being a part of autistic culture. You know, obviously everyone's different, and we still need to learn about the individual and their unique experiences, and not kind of simply project our own lived experience onto others, because that's not helpful either. You know, but I've had feedback from clients that there's sort of a qualitative difference when working with a psychologist who is also autistic. So things like less misunderstandings, less of a burden of translation of autistic communication and experiences. So often that burden of translation between the autistic and non-autistic culture, unfortunately, falls to the autistic person, even though they are, you know, the client in the therapy client sort of relationship. rather than falling to the psychologist. And so that can create a real barrier to kind of being fully seen and understood. So, in terms of sort of autistic psychologists, I've been told by clients that it takes less work on their part to be understood when they're communicating. And there are actually quite a lot of autistic psychologists in Australia. It's just that many aren't out professionally as autistic. And unfortunately, the stigma around autism means that there's this real fear of professional repercussions. So like from regulatory bodies, there's this fear of receiving notifications just for being autistic or being sort of perceived or treated differently by our colleagues. And, when our colleagues don't know that we're autistic and they are speaking about autism to us or near us, we're unfortunately privy to many of the really outdated and stigmatized beliefs that are still held by many professionals. And that makes it even more unsafe to kind of openly say I am autistic in a professional context. So, while professionals need to further develop their understanding of autism in relation to clinical practice for the benefit of their clients, first and foremost, a shift in the way that autism is perceived by professionals would also assist more psychologists and other medical and allied professionals to be openly autistic, which would then allow autistic clients to kind of actively seek out autistic professionals if that's their preference. Not every autistic person wants an autistic professional, but, as part of that healthcare team. So it's a win-win.
Thanks, Erin. We might have time for one more quick question. So the question is, I'd love to hear the panel discuss in what ways having the opportunity to see an autistic mental health professional might be beneficial. I think that's been answered. Next question. I see loved ones struggling getting several mental health diagnoses and having some signs of autism. How can I raise the possibility of ASD with them in a helpful way? Anyone in the panel? Axel?
I think just being forthright is quite a good tactic, honestly. If you're not speaking about autism in a way that stigmatizes it, there's no reason for that person to take it as something derogatory or dangerous or unhelpful. If you know the person well enough to be thinking that perhaps they have ASD, I assume that you know how to communicate with them. And even if it's something that they don't want to pursue right away, that doesn't resonate with them straight away, it's something they can talk to their clinicians about. It's something that they can ruminate on if they want to. And I'm inclined to think that forthright communication as an autistic person is the best way forward for most things. So yeah, I would say just speaking with them clearly about it would be the first step, but I'd be interested if anyone else has other more specific advice.
Would anybody else like to weigh in? Otherwise we might conclude. Jack?
Yeah, look, something that I found particularly helpful when I was exploring, I guess, my own autistic identity was to turn to sort of autobiographical accounts from autistic people. There are heaps and heaps of blogs online written by autistic adults who go through basically every element of the autistic experience that you could ever want to know about. So perhaps referring the person to some of those blogs, I found that was really helpful for me in terms of just coming across things that I really, really resonated with. Was very helpful in terms of solidifying the idea in my mind that actually, yes, I am autistic. And yeah, so I guess along with what Axel has said about being forthright, also I guess giving the person something to turn to do their own research and do a bit of reading, do a bit of learning, and hopefully they will then either find themselves relating to those experiences and you know, identifying with that, or maybe not, and maybe they'll decide that they're not actually autistic. But yeah, I think turning to the autistic community and the resources that exist online is a really good idea.
Thanks, Jack. I have to second that. That's how I came to my really late diagnosis, if it wasn't for those blogs and things online. So yeah. Well, thank you so much to our panel. Thank you, Jack, Jilly, Axel and Erin. That concludes our discussion panel. And now it's time for the lunch break. So during this time, you can explore the research posters from early career researchers and students in the research booth. I also encourage you to visit the sponsored booths. You can video chat with poster presenters and sponsors between 12:30 and 1:30. And after lunch, Corinne will be your MC once again. So we'll see you back here at 1:30. But before you go, we have a team on standby if you need to speak to a psychologist. So you can find the phone number in the document under the Supports and Accessibility tab, and also the Contact Us tab. And that's it. Thanks for joining.